A few hours passed since Carol left for the 7-Eleven located on Wheeler Road, which was just above the Washington, D.C. Maryland state line in the state of Maryland. It was getting late and Allentine knew her daughter should have been home by now. The store was only a half a mile from the apartment and several hours had passed. She dialed 911. Allentine filed a missing persons report that night, April 25, 1971. She was also able to organize a neighborhood search party that evening before she filed the report. The volunteers were made up of mostly family members and friends of Allentine. Here's Romaine Jenkins speaking on Carol Spinks.
Well, Carol Spinks, they had been there were protests and there were lots of search parties looking for her while she was missing. Okay, she was last seen, I think it was April the 25th, 1971, and her remains weren't discovered until May the 1st.
May Day 1971. It was now 6 days since Carol Spinks disappeared. The clerk that was on duty at the 7-Eleven on the evening Carol was last seen verified that the groceries found near the store were indeed the same items he'd sold Carol Spinks on April 25th. A 14-year-old from the neighborhood told the police she saw Carol on her way home with a bag of groceries in her hand. On Saturday, May 1st, 1971, an 11-year-old boy was walking near a grassy embankment along the Anacostia Freeway, which is located a couple of miles from Carol's apartment. He wandered off from his group of friends as they played on the hill. Suddenly, something caught his eye. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was a body. There lied Carol Spinks. The location outside of St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a psychiatric hospital located in southeast Washington, D.C., not even a mile from where Carol was last seen. In the 1970s, St. Elizabeth's Hospital housed thousands of patients, from veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder to murderers. Carol Spinks was wearing the same clothes she wore in the convenience store, a red sweater, blue shorts, and brown socks. Yet there was one strange detail present. Her shoes were missing.
To work on Carol Spinks, which was the first case, and the division commander stopped us and asked where were we going. We said, well, a little girl had been found dead on 295 and she had been murdered. And we were going out to the neighborhood to see what we could find out. And he told us no, that the orders were we could not go because of the May Day demonstrations, and everybody was on high alert, even the homicide unit. And so, that kind of stopped us at that time. However, that didn't mean that the case went, no one did anything on the case, because there was a lot of follow-up statements were taken and so forth.
A short distance down the road, the 11-year-old was able to flag down a police officer. Shortly thereafter, 2 detectives were sent to the scene. Romaine heard the news of a young girl's remains being found on the grounds of St. Elizabeth's Hospital property. Her immediate thought was to accompany the 2 detectives on this case. Unfortunately, her commander had other intentions for Romaine. The commander told her that she wasn't needed on the case and instructed her to go to assist with the May Day demonstrations. Romaine felt puzzled and uneasy as she was one of the detectives specifically focused on the children's deaths and abortions, which were illegal at the time.
Were you upset when you were told, no, you have to go deal with the May Day protesters instead of, going to really investigate this murder with Carol Spinks?
Yes, I was concerned about it, but, the police department is semi-military and you have to follow orders,
Right.
And so, with the division commander saying, no, we couldn't, I was concerned at the time, yes.
You can end the war! Not another dime for this war! Stand up and do your constitutional duty!
The May Day protests. These protests occurred in Washington, D.C. during the first week of May in 1971. These protests were in opposition to the Vietnam War and the United States' involvement with the war. The protests began early that morning, and apparently regulating the protesters took precedence over a newly discovered slain 13-year-old girl's body.
Many protests against the war in Vietnam, and there were hundreds of thousands of protesters here in D.C. And the police ended up locking up so many people, they couldn't put them all in the jail. I remember a place called Uline Arena, which you might not know about, but they had to put people over there. They had to build makeshift jails to keep all the people. And then demonstrators were, there were so many of them, and they just pretty much took over the city, and they were protesting the Vietnam War. And we had lots of people coming into the city. I guess we could probably say some of them might have been in Vietnam, but the protesters were mostly Caucasian, and they had a lot of passion against the war. And then they had the Kent State incident where students from Kent State were shot down during demonstrations. So it was just a lot of upheaval, and the city was just really upside down. So then these cases started happening, and no one probably realized what they were going to develop into. After the first case, and then a second case, and as the series continued on, it took a while for the police department to realize that they had a problem on their hands.
Meanwhile, the detectives canvassed the scene, searching the nearby neighborhoods for any possible clues. Without delay, the detectives were able to surmise that the human remains were likely Carol Spinks, the teen who was reported missing about a week ago. The results of the autopsy were gruesome. Carol was brutally beaten, cuts covered her body, specifically her torso and arms. Her face had a significant number of cuts and bruises, as if she was repeatedly punched. Small green fibers were found on her clothing. To make matters worse, the examiner discovered that Carol was raped and sodomized. The cause of death, strangulation. Despite all of the previous details mentioned, this may be the most chilling aspect. Since Carol's body was decomposing for 2 to 3 days, it was revealed that there was some sort of citrus fruit in her stomach. With this in mind, the medical examiner concluded that Carol's murderer kept her alive for days and as a result fed her during her time in captivity.
Okay, so this is where I get really creeped out by this guy, because it takes a different type of mind to keep someone alive all the while knowing what you're going to do.
So you think he knew he was going to kill her?
For sure.
Yeah, I guess I agree, because, he kept her alive, and probably he even told her that she was going to go home when, he had no intention of taking her back home. So it's all very sick, and I think he was almost working himself up to do it.
I definitely feel that, especially because this is allegedly his first kill.
A couple of months passed since Carol Spinks' body was uncovered. 16-year-old Darlenia Johnson lived at 3922 Wheeler Road, Southeast Washington, D.C. This area of Washington, D.C. is also known as Congress Heights. Her address is less than a mile from Carol Spinks' home. Darlenia was enjoying her summer break by spending most of her time between her boyfriend, friends, and her summer job at the local recreation center, Oxen Run Recreation Center. On July 8, 1971, Darlenia began her usual walk to work, which was about a mile away from her home. At the time, Oxen Run Recreation Center was located in the Green School in Mississippi and Wheeler Road in Southeast. Prior to leaving home for work, she told her mother that she would not be home that night as the rec center was having an overnight trip for the kids. Her mother knew not to expect her home until sometime the following day.
She told her family she wasn't coming home that night because it was an overnight camping trip. So did she go to be with her murderer? We don't know.
The lead with the black car yielded no results. There were no details. Therefore, the detectives began to dive into the second lead, which involved Darlenia's boyfriend. Detectives were met with resistance when they initially tried to question the boyfriend. However, they were ultimately able to eliminate him as a suspect. Days later, an employee of the D.C. Department of Highways and Traffic coincidentally pulled over to the side of the Anacostia Freeway, an interstate connecting D.C. and Maryland. He was experiencing car trouble. After he exited his car, it didn't take long before he saw a body. The body was Darlenia Johnson. He immediately called the D.C. police and reported the discovery. Beat cops were sent to the scene, and afterwards they reported that there was nothing there. Another day passed. The original caller revisited the scene with the intention of checking to see if the officers did investigate the dead body situation. When the caller arrived at the scene, he discovered that the remains were in the exact same place where he found them. In addition to all of this, it's the middle of July. During 1971, the average high temperature for July was 84 degrees. Picture a human body in the sun all day during the heat of the summer. The body appeared to be untouched, yet naturally the summer elements really took its toll. The same cops who were called to the scene both times made no attempts to get out of the car and search the area.
Okay, when Darlenia Johnson's remains were found, an investigation was conducted. However, the homicide unit was really upset at the time because her remains were laid out approximately 15 feet from Carol Spinks, where Carol Spinks was found. And she laid out there so long, even though the guy who worked for the Department of Highways and Traffic observed the remains, the police didn't find the remains until the 19th of July.
Right.
And so she had laid out there so long that, decomposition had set in, so we really didn't have a cause of death on her.
So looking back at some of the facts from this case, you can definitely see that there were several fumbles, just really horrible handling of this case. And this scenario was for sure one of those times.
Agreed. Leaving a body to rot to the point you can't even exhume it properly.
I don't get it, because it was just a big screw you to the Black community. These types of things happen when it comes to investigating deaths of Black kids. So now I can only imagine what it was like back then. No one was reprimanded for this, and no real action was taken to punish these officers for the mishandling.
And then he abducts another girl from the same neighborhood. That's just so bold and cunning.
This is also the second victim with the middle name Denise, which is very interesting.
Very creepy.
Meanwhile, the caller decided to revisit the scene where he found the body, and needless to say, he was instantly furious. He reported the remains twice, and here they were, still lying there, decomposing even quicker due to the heat, humidity, and the heavy summer sun. Ironically, his neighbor happened to be on the force, so he asked the officer to check the situation out.
A guy who worked for the Department of Highways and Traffic was the first person to observe the body, and I think that was around July the 12th. And he called the police, and according to the transcript, the police said nothing found. They went to the area and they said nothing found. And then, I guess a day or so later, he sees that the body is still there, so he calls again.
Charles Baden was a sergeant for the Metropolitan Police Department, and he decided to visit the scene on his day off. He was able to immediately get the police involved. Darlenia's remains weren't taken into custody until after a week of the original report. She was found lying on the same hill, a mere 15 feet from where Carol's body was discovered.
And he told his neighbor, and his neighbor, the sergeant in traffic division, went and located the body and called the police, and that's how the remains were found, which is, totally ridiculous. But, it goes back to officers being, I would say, lazy. If you roll down 295 at a high rate of speed, you weren't going to see that body or any other body. You'd have to park your car and get out and walk and look. And the police officers did not do that. They should have found that body. That body should not have laid up there that long.
Darlenia was kidnapped from the same neighborhood as Carol and dumped 15 feet from her. They both share the same middle name, not to mention the clothes on her body were the same clothing she was last seen in. But one thing was missing: her shoes. The case wasn't without its differences, though. The medical examiner was not able to determine much of anything about what had taken place before Darlenia died. She was so badly decomposed. There could have been sexual assault, but there was no way to know for sure. There was, however, evidence of strangulation. Another similarity with the Spinks murder. On the next episode of Somebody's Watching.
When my mom saw it was getting dark and the movie was about to come on, she asked where was Brenda and had anybody seen her, so she actually went looking for her. She went back to the store to try to find my sister, and she couldn't find her. And while my mom was out, I was home. I was only 7, and my mom's boyfriend at the time was there. And whoever abducted my sister took her somewhere, and either he let her make a call or two, or she snuck a call or two.
If you have any tips regarding the Freeway Phantom case, please call 202-656-5299 or visit the website www.somebodieswatchingpodcast.com.